Welcome to the Anxious Child Podcast, the podcast that helps you best work with anxious kids and teens. Now, here's your host, Stephen Quinlan.
Hey everyone, I am beyond excited today to have Dr. Dawn Huebner on the show. Some of you may have heard of her through her best-selling book, What to Do When You Worry Too Much. She is also the author of 9 other best-selling books, including one of her most recent ones that we focus on today, Outsmarting Worry, which is an older kid's guide to managing anxiety. Dr. Huebner is a clinical psychologist who not only is at the forefront of helping parents and kids with anxiety, but she also has a unique ability to take these sometimes complicated subjects and present them in an easily accessible fashion. You can see this in her books, which are primarily designed for kids ages 6 to 12, and I think you'll see it in our conversation today as well. We also go over some of the catalysts for her getting into this work, which was her son struggling with anxiety and her having difficulty finding treatment that was effective for him. Dr. Huebner's books have been translated into 23 languages. She's been featured on The Today Show, CNN, WebMD, and many other news and information outlets, and is frequently interviewed by popular parenting magazines. Dr. Huebner's TED Talk on rethinking anxiety has been viewed over 600,000 times. It's a truly enlightening conversation, one of my favorites, and I'm so thankful to her for setting aside the time to be with us here today. What an absolute treat. I'm so thrilled to be able to offer up this information to as many people who need to hear it. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. I think we can all agree that we don't need any extra anxiety in our life. We know something that causes anxiety is clutter, especially cord clutter. Mount Genie at mountgenie.com makes clever tech accessories and mounting solutions for your Alexa, Google Home, video game consoles, and all brands of Wi-Fi mesh router networks that rein in that messy cord clutter in your home or office. Mount Genie also has organizational solutions for your keys, remotes, sunglasses, and more. Most install without tools in minutes and won't cause damage to walls. Mount Genie is a family-owned company solving your cord clutter problems. Check them out today at mountgenie.com. And don't forget, while you're there, to enter in the code anxiety10 to get 10% off. I've got several of their products in my house, and they really look great. They're super easy to install. So check them out today at mountgenie.com, and don't forget the code anxiety10 at checkout. If you want to be healthier, one of the best things you can possibly do is get at least 7 hours of quality sleep every night. I know it's hard to get that much sleep sometimes. Your mind keeps you awake. You can't get comfortable. There are 100 reasons why you can't get 7 hours quality sleep. But it's super important because your body heals itself when you're asleep. Do you want to know an easy way to get more quality sleep every night? Make sure you're getting enough magnesium. Believe it or not, around 75% of people don't have enough of it. But please don't run to the store to buy the first magnesium supplement you find. Most magnesium supplements use only the 2 cheapest synthetic forms. And since they're not full spectrum, they won't fix your magnesium deficiency. There are actually 7 unique forms of magnesium, and you must get all of them if you want to experience its calming, sleep-enhancing benefits. That's why I recommend Magnesium Breakthrough by BioOptimizers. Simply take 2 capsules before you go to bed, and you'll be amazed at how much better you sleep and how much more rested you feel when you wake up. For an exclusive offer for my listeners, go to that's MAG, breakthrough.com/anxiety and use the code anxiety10 during checkout to save 10%. All right. I'm really excited to release this episode. I actually listened to it over again a couple of times myself because there was so much great information here. It's applicable both for parents and professionals and really anyone who has anxiety and is trying to figure out the best way, not necessarily to make it go away, but of finding new ways to be with it and not to run away from it. So here we go. Sit back and relax, maybe grab a pen and paper and enjoy. Here is me and Dr. Don Huebner. Well, welcome, Dr. Huebner. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm thrilled that you're here.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start a little bit just with sort of your background and how you became involved in the work that you're doing. I know in 1987, you became a psychologist, and then you started, I guess, specializing in anxiety. Your son was having some issues around that, and I thought was rather hilariously misdiagnosed as having Oedipal issues as opposed to actual anxiety. And that led you towards the sort of CBT techniques that you're doing today.
Yeah, so I started out as just kind of a generalist, a general psychologist. I was not trained in cognitive behavioral therapy. I was trained in more psychodynamic techniques. And as you said, I had a son who had trouble with anxiety and became increasingly paralyzed by pretty severe phobias. And I didn't really know how to treat anxiety, and I did everything wrong, which many parents do innocently. And he got worse and worse and worse. And we went to a therapist who turned out to not be particularly helpful to us. And it was at that point that I realized I just need to figure out how to help my kid. And I kind of stumbled upon cognitive behavioral therapy. It's not something that was covered in my graduate program in the 1980s. Started to learn it and started to apply some of the techniques. And it was really transformative, like in kind of remarkable ways with my son. And I started incorporating it into my own clinical practice, with clients, and clearly educating myself further, going to workshops and things of that sort. So that's how I kind of came to this field and this kind of work. One of the things that really excites me about it is that it works. It really, it can make just a tremendous difference for people who are pretty paralyzed by anxiety issues.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And now, of course, it's fascinating. I didn't realize that wasn't covered, in graduate school in the 80s, because now it's become essentially the gold standard for practice, certainly with anxiety. Can you tell me a little bit about how you went from that to becoming an author and writing these books that are out now?
Yeah. So as I was using cognitive behavioral techniques with children in my clinical practice, it became clear that it would be helpful for those kids and those families to have some take-home materials that they could review the techniques, they could practice the things that they were learning about. And so first I developed just kind of a booklet that I Xeroxed and gave out to clients. And over the course of, maybe a year and a half, 2 years, I decided that I would develop that into an actual manuscript that I would submit to a real publisher, try to get it made into a book. And that was my first book, which is What to Do When You Worry Too Much. And it's now sold about 1 million copies in 23 languages all around the world. But I developed kind of a model with that book that was an interactive format that would teach kids basic cognitive behavioral techniques in a way that they could customize them to meet their own situation. So the books have kind of a drawing and writing component to them. And because that first book was successful, the publisher contracted with me to turn it into a series. And I did a number of other books in that same format. Those are called the What to Do Guides for Kids. And that was all 10, 15 years ago. That was a while ago now. And since that time, I've shifted to a different publisher and continued to write self-help kinds of books for kids with different formats from that original one.
And you have the What to Do When You Worry Too Much is, I feel like I see in just about every therapist office everywhere. So it's certainly this ubiquitous book now, which is wonderful. I have it myself. And I also have a copy of your more recent one, which is Outsmarting Worry, which I guess is designed more towards older kids, as 9 to 13 years old.
It is. So it's for somewhat older kids who are better able to understand some of the brain science around anxiety and more of the why behind certain techniques. So why does exposure work? Or how do you tolerate a difficult or anxious feeling? So there's more explanation that older kids are able to benefit from, understand and benefit from. But it's the same, it's the same basic skill set about learning how to identify anxiety and move towards rather than away from the things that you're afraid of.
I think many of the techniques that you describe are actually applicable to sort of all ages. But one of the things I think you've done so nicely and you have the skill at is making it, I guess, digestible or approachable for certain age groups. I love the illustrations and like in the Outsmarting Worry, for example, you have the flamingo who's sort of everywhere. And there's one where I think he's giving the worry a D- for originality.
Right.
I just love that.
I've been really fortunate with illustrators. And you're right that with anxiety, techniques are kind of one size fits all. So same skill set is going to be useful for a 6-year-old and for a 60-year-old, but they need to be explained in different ways. So you're absolutely right about that. And I think one of the strengths of my books is that they make them accessible to kids in the age groups that I'm gearing towards. And it's important for kids, I think, to understand something about the techniques or to have the techniques presented to them in language that resonates with them, because we want kids to kind of get it, to be motivated and to feel empowered to do these things, so that it's not a therapist or a parent who's trying to kind of make them do something. Mm-hmm. It's a child who's kind of understanding how to take back control from anxiety, and with parent support. But child is kind of electively moving into this new way of responding to worry.
Dr. Huebner, you mentioned earlier exposure, and I know a lot of what you do is that exposure and response prevention. Can you explain that a little bit for somebody who's not familiar?
Yeah, sure. So when a person is feeling anxious, they typically want nothing more than to have the feeling end, because anxiety is just a hugely uncomfortable feeling. So often when a person is feeling anxious, they avoid the things that triggered that anxiety. So if they feel anxious about germs, they're going to avoid anything that they see as germy. Or if they feel anxious about possibly being kidnapped, they're going to avoid sleeping alone. Or they feel anxious about dogs, they're going to avoid dogs. If they feel anxious about getting something wrong, they're going to avoid raising their hands and answering questions. So avoidance becomes kind of the go-to mechanism. Avoidance is tremendously reinforcing, right? So you're afraid of something, you avoid that thing, you feel better. And the fact that you feel better makes you feel like you need to continue to avoid to escape the anxious feeling. But the more a person avoids those triggers, the more anxiety takes hold, because you get into like this cycle of avoidance. So exposure means purposely moving towards the things that you're afraid of, practicing doing the things that you're afraid of in intentional kinds of ways, and learning to kind of ride out the anxiety and uncertainty that you feel, rather than immediately turning and running when you begin to feel anxious or unsure. So exposure, it's essentially like if you were going to jump into a swimming pool and get used to the cold water, that's, you're desensitizing. And a part of exposure has to do with desensitization, but it's sort of purposely putting yourself into a situation. That's what exposure means. And you're right that is really the hallmark of treatment of anxiety.
Okay. You mentioned in the book that there's 2 different ways to sort of go into that metaphorical swimming pool. One is kind of the cannonball approach where you're just like, all right, I'm going to go for it here. And then the other is that little sort of dipping your toes in. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So that swimming pool metaphor turns out to be a really good one to teach to kids, because virtually all children have had the experience of immersing themselves in a cold pool and having it feel really cold, and swimming and playing. And then after a little while, they don't notice the cold anymore. So the temperature of the water hasn't changed. They just don't notice it anymore. They've gotten used to it or desensitized. And kids also can understand that there are two ways to get into that pool to begin with. As you said, there's a plunge-in method and there's a step-by-step method. So we can import all of that when we're thinking about anxiety and beginning to expose to the things that we're afraid of. So if you take the example of, let's say, a fear of bees, so kids who are afraid of bees tend to avoid going outside or avoid being any place where there might be a bee in the spring and summer. If you were going to do a plunge-in method of exposure, that means purposely spending lots and lots of time outside, preferably in places where bees congregate, so that you're able to get used to that situation. It's hard to do plunge-in exposure. Yeah. Most typically, people do a step-by-step. So you might start out with going outside, but on blacktop rather than in a field or in a garden, or getting closer to where bees are, but still, many feet distanced from them. You're doing kind of a step-by-step. What's really important about exposure is two things. One is that it's intentional. So you don't wait until you happen to be in the anxiety-producing situation. You create the anxiety-producing situation. So it's like intentional practice. And the other thing is that for step-by-step exposure, it needs to be progressive, right? Mm-hmm. So you don't just take that very first dip your toes in step. You need to take that dip your toes in step and do that a few times, practice it, and then take the next step. You're thinking in terms of increasingly moving out of a comfort zone a little bit at a time with intentional, frequent practice. When you're doing exposure, there are actually two things that you're getting used to. One is the situation, whatever it is. So in the case of a fear of bees, you're getting used to being outside in a place where you might see a bee, or you're getting used to being outside and seeing a bee and staying outside anyway. So you're getting used to the situation yourself. The other thing that you're getting used to is your fear. And it's actually the exposure and the desensitization to the anxiety itself that's the more important piece of this. So there are times that kids will come to me, we've worked out some kind of exposure hierarchy, and they'll come in and they'll say, Dr. Huebner, I did, whatever it was. I went upstairs by myself and I didn't even feel afraid. And I congratulate them, but I'm also on the inside thinking, shoot, because that tells me that it wasn't a big enough step. Like the whole point is to feel afraid and to do the thing anyway, or to stay in it. So it's important for kids and for parents and, therapists to understand that piece, that you're trying to kind of make the size of the steps just right, not so easy that there's no fear evoked at all, that's not an effective exposure. And you also don't want it to be so hard that it's impossible for a child. But kids are really good at helping to determine what's a medium step. Like we're aiming for a medium difficulty in exposure activities. And kids are able to do that once they, kind of understand all of this conceptually.
I love that it's that you're upfront about that this is difficult. It's not going to be sort of this cakewalk, or necessarily that you're going to feel an alleviation of the anxiety right away, but that you have to put the work in order to do this. I'm wondering if initially, do you get pushback to even taking those scaled back, smaller steps and just starting the process at all with any of these kids or parents? And if so, how do you manage that?
Yes, there's almost always pushback on parents and children in two different ways. So I'm going to do the pushback from kids first. Again, anxiety is really, really uncomfortable, and people often make their way into therapy with the goal of getting rid of the anxiety. There's not a way to get rid of the anxiety without going through it, which means that you need to learn how to tolerate the anxiety before you can reduce the anxiety. And Kids often think in kind of black and white sorts of ways about, I can't do that, whatever that is, period. I cannot do that. And so with children, my strategy tends to be to carve the initial step down as small as it needs to be. So I want a child in the beginning to make a commitment to just do something. So even if it's like just to follow this example about bees, even if it's to stand in the doorway rather than going fully outside. And, they do the stand in the doorway every day for 10 minutes. And then the next day you're going to take one step out from, onto your front porch or whatever, just tiny, tiny, tiny steps. And if you think again about the pool analogy, if you're a person who likes to get into a pool gradually in a step-by-step way, usually the first step is the very hardest. Your feet and ankles are wet and it's freezing cold and it's uncomfortable. And you take the next step and that's pretty bad too. And the next step is, maybe kind of bad also. But by the time you're in there up to your waist, you often just feel ready to plunge in the rest of the way. So you go from your waist to fully diving in. And it's the same kind of thing with exposures. It's okay if they start really, really tiny, really small, really tentative. It's just important to do it, make a commitment to doing it daily and to very gradually add on. And with kids, I find that when there's no tug of war about the size of the first step or what specific thing that first step is going to be, kids often become more willing to do it. The issue with parents is a little different. So, parents are highly responsive to their children's distress, and parents have trouble tolerating the fact that children are as distressed as they are. So parents are often wanting to rescue their children from the distress that they feel. And so the work with parents is largely about helping them understand that their child is afraid, but not actually in danger, that it's okay that they're afraid, that it's important for parents to be modeling calm in the face of their child's distress and fear. Often, children's anxiety triggers parents' anxiety, so it's not unusual for me to need to do some work with parents about managing their own anxiety so that they can better manage their child's anxiety. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. It's interesting too. I'm thinking as you're talking about the overall sort of culture at present that we live in. And I'm wondering if you feel like any of that contributes to this in the sense of, there's this idea of quick fixes and life hacks and everyone wants, instant gratification. And I think there's also a sense of helicopter parents that you hear a lot about these days who, although maybe coming from a good place, they want to keep their kids in this safe bubble, not only from just necessarily actual dangerous situations, which I think we've actually come a long way on. We don't let kids ride in the back of pickup trucks anymore.
Right.
Everybody wears a seatbelt, but also just emotionally, I feel like there's so much protectiveness that goes on. Do you notice that in kind of a more macro level?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're raising a really good point. I do think that we've moved as a society into a place where we really are not comfortable and we have difficulty tolerating strong feelings, not just anxiety, but frustration, disappointment. We're all busy trying to distract ourselves away from or quickly smooth over or fix any kind of big uncomfortable feelings. I've actually moved in my practice from doing psychotherapy with children to doing coaching with parents. And some percentage of it is parents of anxious children, and it's helping with anxiety specifically. But more broadly, it's about parenting a child who has big feelings. And a lot of it has to do with helping parents learn how to stay calm and connected with their child through the big feeling rather than scrambling to make the big feeling go away. Because the only way that a child can learn how to tolerate a big feeling, including anxiety, is if a support person like a parent is calm and stays empathic and emotionally connected with them through the feeling. So the message all the way around is, I see you, I hear you, I understand what you're feeling, but it's not trying to make it all go away or talk a child out of the feeling or whatever. I work with parents on or families on the distinction between being afraid and being in danger. So it's important for parents to understand that their child is legitimately afraid, like, the feeling that they feel is fear, but they're not in danger. And so we need to support them with the fear, like be emotionally supportive around the fear, but we need to be clear on the fact that there's no danger here. So we don't need to accommodate the fear. And maybe can we talk for a minute about accommodation and what that means?
Yeah, please.
So there's been some really interesting research that's been done on parental accommodation of anxiety. And what accommodation means is changing what you're saying or doing or expecting of your child because of their anxiety. So a child who's maybe has a fear of throwing up and is really afraid at all times that they're going to be sick might want their parent to feel their forehead or take their temperature or review with them what are the signs that you're sick. A child might ask their parent before they eat, is this okay for me to eat? Is this going to make me sick? And when parents do those things that anxiety demands. So take temperature multiple times a day, feel forehead, reassure that it's okay to eat certain food, reassure that the child's not sick. That's all called accommodation. You're changing what you're doing in an attempt to help your child feel less nervous. So the research that's been done has shown that 97% of parents who have anxious children accommodate the anxiety. And accommodation is one of the main things that holds anxiety in place. It absolutely locks it into place. Parents accommodate in a well-intentioned way. They're trying to protect the child that they love from the distress that they feel. So accommodation is well-meaning, but it is not helpful. And one of the things that parents need to learn how to do is be emotionally supportive of their child without accommodating the anxiety. And the things that go into emotional support are acknowledgement. So I understand this is scary for you, or I can see how hard this is. So, kind of an empathic statement. And then encouragement. You've got skills, or I know you can handle this. So it's kind of acknowledging the distress. It's coaching or reminding about ability to manage something. And importantly, it is not providing accommodations for the anxiety. And teaching parents how to take steps back from accommodation is important work for therapists and, other people who are trying to help families where anxiety has taken hold. It's something also that often has to be done in a step-by-step way. Parents are sort of gradually withdrawing accommodations. And, it's not as if we want to have parents do the equivalent of kind of pushing their child into the deep end of the pool, but we are wanting parents to have an expectation that a child's going to get into the pool. And, we're sort of needing to teach parents how to do that.
That's fascinating. That 97% number really jumps off the page. I wasn't aware of that. That's amazing.
Yeah. And interestingly, it's not just parents who accommodate, schools do too. And in fact, schools are mandated to accommodate.
That's a good point. IEPs and
Yeah. And so when I give talks at schools or consult at schools, a lot of that is around how to provide accommodations that are actually helpful. So we want to be accommodating the child without accommodating the anxiety. And to the extent that we are needing to accommodate the anxiety, those accommodations need to be dynamic, meaning they need to change over time rather than just be locked in place.
One of the things you talk about too in the book are these ideas of thinking mistakes. And I think it's the third one of the mistakes, which is that kids have the worry will trick the kids into thinking that they are unable to deal with what it is that's coming. I wonder if in some sense that everything that you're describing parents and schools, and maybe even that broader way, society has fallen into that trap somewhat of thinking that kids aren't going to be able to handle these things that life throws at them. And so that we need to shield them, which of course makes it worse.
Yes. And, one of the things that parents often feel bewildered by and frustrated about is that a child can have the same fear over and over again, and the parent forces them into the situation, and the child does fine. Mm-hmm. But the next time that situation arises, the child's just as afraid as they were the first time. So a child might be really anxious about going to soccer practice because what if they make a mistake and other kids laugh at them? Or what if the coach corrects them or yells at them, right? And so they get a stomachache before every soccer practice and they say, I don't want to go to soccer, it's boring, or, I don't like soccer anymore. And the parent maybe forces them to go and the child ends up having a great practice or a great game, feels good about it. But the next time it's time for soccer practice, they're right back where they were before. And the reason for that is that the child is responding less to the soccer practice and more to their own anxiety. And that's another reason why we need to teach kids how to tolerate anxiety and move into it rather than always moving away from it.
Yeah, there's something that it's interesting, even myself as a clinician and as a parent, and knowing these things, that you have to go directly into the anxiety. And you talk in the book also about mindfulness, which also teaches us the same principle of you have to be able to sit with the feeling on some level in order for it to pass by, or the thought to pass by, or what have you. I know all these things, and yet I feel like almost a certain reticence at talking to kids or my own kids directly about things like neurology, the amygdala, all of these things, because I think on some level, maybe I question, like, are they going to understand what I'm talking about? Right, or is that going to go over their head? And maybe we're selling them short, I think.
Yeah, I think that all of this can be translated for younger kids in ways that make sense to them. But kids who are about, age 7 or 8 and up actually kind of like learning the brain stuff, I think. It's kind of cool for them. One of the analogies that I think helps this make sense for both kids and parents is that of a smoke detector. So our amygdala, which is the part within our brain that is on the lookout for potential dangers and trying to keep us safe, our amygdala is kind of like a smoke detector. It's going to alert us to possible danger, right? And as you know, with a smoke detector, we have smoke detectors to keep us safe from fire. But it's not like for a smoke detector itself, a smoke detector is not tuned to fire, it's tuned to smoke. And smoke is sometimes a sign of a fire, but it's sometimes a sign of a piece of toast stuck in a toaster or a candle burning too close to the smoke detector. So the same blaring alarm is going to happen from the smoke detector for any kind of smoke, regardless of the cause of the smoke. And sometimes the smoke signals an actual emergency like a fire. Often it does not. And our amygdala is the same as that. The amygdala is going to go off at any possible danger. Possible danger is very different from actual danger, right? And so we're wanting kids to develop some understanding of that so that they can understand that there's a concept of a false alarm. So my amygdala has gotten triggered, but I'm not actually in danger. And one of the places that mindfulness and breathing activities come in is that they help to kind of quiet the brain once the amygdala alarm has gotten triggered, to bring logical thinking back on board so that there can be an assessment made about, am I actually in danger here, or was this a false alarm?
Yeah, that's that metaphor is such a lovely example of what I think you do so well, is to be able to take that complicated subject matter and make it really accessible to anybody, these sort of everyday objects that everyone understands. You talk also about the idea of these safety behaviors, which again, I love the illustrations of the guy kind of decked out in what looks like some kind of a hazmat suit or something.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about those and explain what you mean by that.
Sure. So there's a loop that holds anxiety in place, and there are 4 parts to that loop that feeds around in a circle.
Mhm.
So the first is the perception of danger. Danger is really broadly defined. So anything that could be uncomfortable, dangerous, hurtful, embarrassing, scary, bad, right? So the perception of danger. And that leads to anxiety or fear, which totally makes sense because if any of us think that we're in danger, we're going to feel afraid. After we feel anxious or afraid, we get tempted to do a safety behavior. And a safety behavior is a behavior designed to protect us from the thing that we think is dangerous and to reduce our anxiety. So in the case of a child who's afraid of making a mistake, let's say, their safety behavior would be not raising their hand. If they don't raise their hand, they get protected from the possibility of making a mistake and from their anxiety around making a mistake. Or a child who's afraid of a bad guy upstairs, their safety behavior might be not going upstairs alone or insisting that, parent or sibling or family pet accompany them. Those are safety behaviors. Safety behaviors bring relief. And that makes sense again. The safety behavior is designed to protect you from this perceived danger and to reduce your anxiety. And they do reduce your anxiety. But it's a problem that safety behaviors reduce anxiety because children who do safety behaviors get very committed to them. They begin to feel that the only way to stay safe and to not feel paralyzing levels of anxiety is to do safety behaviors. And safety behaviors tend to snowball. They grow over time and they get more and more problematic. One of the main problems with safety behaviors is that kids who do them think that they're actually protective. So a child might think, good thing I didn't go upstairs alone. Otherwise, Bloody Mary might have been upstairs or a vampire might have been upstairs. Or good thing I didn't raise my hand. I didn't make a mistake or the teacher didn't get mad at me.
Right.
So they think the safety behavior, works. Mm-hmm. It's actually protective when really they didn't need to be protected to begin with because the whole thing was a false alarm. So exposure is very much about identifying safety behaviors and chipping away at them, getting rid of them.
Do those correlate to obsessive compulsive behaviors?
Yeah, so this loop maps with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, where the obsession is the initial thought, the perception of danger, and the safety behavior is the compulsion. But the loop holds for other kinds of anxiety difficulties as well. So, kids with separation anxiety or phobias or other kinds of anxiety are busy doing safety behaviors. And accommodation that we talked about earlier, it's when parents or schools participate in the safety behaviors. Right? So, a child wants to wash their hands or feels the need to wash their hands 15 times a day. Accommodation is making soap and towels readily available and letting the child go into the bathroom anytime they feel like they might be dirty, or letting a child carry sanitizer with them, or whatever. It's accommodating the safety behaviors.
It's such a natural parental instinct
right.
And I think, as you were saying earlier, it makes sense that parents need to be sort of gradually guided down that ladder, so to speak, because it is, it does come from that loving place. And also it's something that becomes entrenched and that they've been doing for such a long time anyway. I also enjoy how you're looking at neuroplasticity, and I'm just thinking about entrenched behaviors and how, from a neurological point of view, that can be both negative and positive, so that there's hope if you start really practicing and working towards these things, that you will actually rewire your brain to a point where it no longer becomes potentially as much effort to go through the exposure and response prevention.
Yeah, and that's a really, really good point, that initially this is really effortful, like you're needing to do it on purpose, and it's hard and it takes intention and motivation and time and practice. But the idea is that you are rewiring the brain. So, it's not a Band-Aid for anxiety. This is corrective in terms of how an anxious brain works. And when exposure is designed in a way that part of what a child is exposing themselves to is their own anxiety, like those feelings of discomfort and nervousness and uncertainty, benefit generalizes. You might be doing an exposure that has to do with separation, and a child can begin to have less trouble with anxiety in other areas as well, because what they're learning to do is to tolerate their own anxiety, which is really powerful.
Yeah. And I think that anybody who has ever been sort of through leading up to a potentially anxiety provoking event will start to recognize things once you get on the other side of it of, oh, well, a lot of that was just anticipatory anxiety. Then I got through it and then I got fine. So the more of those experiences that you have, the less you're initially worried about it to begin with. But of course, as children, you don't have as much experience, so that has to be learned more.
Right. And, the physiological component to this is really important. So I used to have really significant trouble with public speaking. Mm-hmm. I was fine one-on-one, but, to speak to a group, even to raise my hand and ask a question in a conference, I would just be incredibly anxious. Early in my career, like after my first few books were published and I was trying to do public speaking before events, I would get the classic, heart pounding, sweaty, dry mouth, stomach uncomfortable. And that was my amygdala had sounded an alarm, right? And my body was responding in a way where it felt like I was in danger. And certainly the easiest thing was to just avoid those situations, right? And it took a ton of practice of making myself do it anyway. It wasn't just like I did it once and I saw, okay, I actually did fine once I got going. It took time after time after time after time of me tolerating the physiological response I had, like the fight or flight response that got triggered before those physiological symptoms started to fade. And I was able to do events without, all that angst prior to that.
Not too much anxiety,
right.
Just a little bit. Just quickly too, you differentiate between the lowercase anxiety or lowercase a, I should say, anxiety that many people experience versus what you treat, which is an uppercase anxiety. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So lowercase worry, I would say, is what most people would think of as normal, right? So you get the jitters before a performance. You feel anxious when someone you love is sick. You feel anxious before a test if you're a child or an adult. So it's anxiety that fits the situation that most people would feel. It tends to be helped by logic and reassurance and support and the passage of time. And so when a child is feeling that kind of situational, normal, lowercase anxiety, there's a different way of managing that as a parent than you manage or respond to uppercase anxiety or worry. Uppercase is outsized. So, the anxiety is out of proportion to the actual threat of the situation. And it's not amenable to logic. And kids with uppercase anxiety tend to crave reassurance, demand reassurance, but not really be helped by it, right? So it's not so much what the anxiety is about, it's more about the impact the anxiety is having that makes it either uppercase or lowercase anxiety.
Okay, so that was how that's interfering with sort of their daily life,
right?
Which is something that it sounds, it's critical for parents to be able to distinguish which one are we looking at here, because that informs what you're going to do about it.
Correct.
Well, I can't thank you enough for all of your wisdom just in general, which you've shared with the world with your books and your practice, but also certainly for being here today. And I'm hopeful that this conversation will also help all those anxious kids and parents out there, because as we know, there are quite a few.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And just quickly too, you have, so Outsmarting Worry is out now. You have another book that came out, which is Something Big Happened.
Something Bad Happened. Which is talking to kids about big bad things happening in the world, not to them personally, but things like mass shootings or forest fires without naming the events. It's a way for parents or other supportive adults to have kind of a facilitated conversation with kids about big, bad things happening in the world and helping kids to process those things and feel safe still and cope with the fact that bad things happen.
Wonderful and timely. And are you also starting, is it some Facebook Live events? Is that coming soon?
I am, yeah.
Okay.
So one other book that's coming out in June 1st is called The Sibling Survival Guide. And that is not just for anxious kids, but for all kids to get along better with siblings. And then, yes, I'm starting a new Facebook Live venture next week. So May 6th is the first one. The first and third Thursday of the month, I'm going to be on Facebook Live doing a Q&A for parents of anxious kids. And sometimes it'll be just me and sometimes me and a guest, all people who have written books, either for anxious kids or parents of anxious kids.
Oh, yeah. that sounds wonderful.
Welcome to join us. Yeah.
Well, great. Thanks. I appreciate it. Well, thanks so much again and appreciate everything you're doing, and we'll be in touch.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Dawn. All right. That was Dr. Dawn Huebner. Her website is dawnhuebnerphd.com. The book we talked about today was Outsmarting Worry. You can find that book and all of her other books on Amazon or wherever books are sold. A quick reminder to everyone, if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on iTunes. You can also support the show by checking out our sponsors, Mount Genie and BioOptimizers, and using the code Anxiety10 for 10% off at either one of those places. You can also check out the website, theanxiouschild.com, if you're interested in individual coaching with me or just to support the podcast in general. And as always, I would love, love, love to hear from you. If you are listening to the show and you have any questions or comments, you can get in touch with me via the website or on Instagram at The Anxious Child Podcast. So that's it for today. Until next time, take care and be in touch.
This podcast is not intended as medical or psychological treatment. In no way should it replace treatment from a mental health professional.